Is the character of Eugene offensive? Now, before you freak out or anything, allow me to remind you that I'm just asking a simple question. I know some people have really strong emotional reactions as soon as you begin to even remotely discuss the idea of something being offensive. For some reason. And remember, this is the Thinking Fans channel, so to think and to ponder and to question is exactly what we do around here. But in order to offset all the crazed people out there, I'm going to ask a little early that you make sure you give this video a big like and that you make sure that you're subscribed to this channel. Now, when it comes to the subject at hand, I think a lot of people feel as if this is an open and shut case, without even having to think about it too hard. But if you stop to really examine this, you might find that it's not as obvious as you might think. And so that's exactly what we're going to do. We're going to take a deep dive into the character of Eugene, we're going to explore the nature of being offended, and we're also going to hear from a member of the Know-It-All Nation that's going to be pretty familiar to you if you frequent the live streams. All that and more, because today... Thank you to all the wonderful supporters out there who support me over on Patreon, like True Sinister and The Reflection of Perfection. To find out how to get your own Patreon shoutout, please go over and check out my Patreon page. Nick Dinsmore would make his professional wrestling debut in 1996. He would start wrestling for the United States Wrestling Association as well as Ohio Valley Wrestling. In the beginning, he would team up with Rob Conway, and the two would win the Southern Tag Team Championship a record-setting 10 times. And on top of that, Dinsmore would also set another 10-time record by winning the Ohio Valley Heavyweight Championship 10 times as well. Furthermore, during these early years, Dinsmore would find himself getting to work as a jobber for WWF on occasion, as well as getting to play Doink the Clown twice. He also got to wrestle for WCW too, albeit as a jobber as well. However, all that would change when he got his big break by debuting on Monday Night Raw, although a lot of people would say that this wasn't for the better. Dinsmore would be welcomed onto WWE TV as the character of Eugene, who was supposed to be Eric Bischoff's kayfabe nephew who was described as being special. He was also supposed to be a wrestling savant, being able to pick up on it merely from watching it on TV. This would be demonstrated by Eugene bringing back old school moves like the airplane spin as well as other signature moves from former WWE superstars. Furthermore, the character of Eugene was said to have taken inspiration from a professional wrestling trainer's autistic child as well as Dustin Hoffman's performance in the movie Rain Man. Okay, so now that we've looked at the early days of Nick Dinsmore as well as discover how he became the character of Eugene, I'm sure there are many of you out there saying to yourselves, of course this character is offensive. But that makes me wonder, why exactly do we get offended in the first place? Well, in an attempt to answer that question, I found out that there really isn't a lot in the way of scientific sources to really answer that question. It's mostly just people getting mad one way or the other about how everyone's offended nowadays. Now, I will admit that this is a really complex subject, and it's hard to define why exactly we get offended, especially from a scientific standpoint. But I did manage to find one source that I think is rather helpful. In an article on psychologytoday.com called Why People Get Offended So Easily, they begin by mentioning that a lot of times when someone says something offensive, they normally don't have any bad intent, or they simply don't consider the effects that their behavior has. And so, while the offensive nature of the character of Eugene might seem very apparent to many of us, we do have to take into consideration the possible lack of consideration of the people who created the character, as according to this article, there is a chance that they weren't doing it specifically to hurt anybody. They might have been just trying to entertain us, they just weren't thinking about the consequences of their actions. The article also goes on to say that people tend to be particularly sensitive to what they feel is criticism or abuse or even neglect. And a lot of times when someone is offended, it's because whatever happened to offend them evokes something from their past, especially when it's something that they feel was particularly traumatizing. But now, something we can take away from this article as well as others that I've found is that when it comes to being offended, a lot of times it really comes down to internal factors rather than anything external. And I'm not just talking about the party that created the offensive content. I'm also talking about when you're offended on behalf of someone else. Because in those cases, the question remains, how much does that someone else's opinion really matter to you? And does it stop you from being offended? Well, I think this raises another good question, and to answer that, I've turned to one of the mods of this channel, and members of the live stream are probably familiar with him. Of course, I'm talking about the Tribal Horror, the Broski of the Week, the Rated Horror Superstar, the OSW Award nominated, Big Harry Cool, the Quick Draw, the Hurricane, Harry Flynn. Take it away, Harry.
Hey, I'm a Hair Maniac. This is Hair Maniac player Harry Flynn here. And my good friend Dave from Dave Knows Wrestling, he called me personally, asked me what are my thoughts on Eugene. And how I feel about Eugene was I kind of liked him. As an autistic man myself, I never found him offensive. He never said like the R word. He worked great at first until they made him like an idiot. And like in a way, he kind of hurt the champion, Chris Benoit. It hurts the champion because now a comedy act is bigger than your world champion who won the title in the main event, your biggest show of the year. And yeah, so that's pretty much it. See you later on my hair, maniacs.
Now Harry's point about the booking does remind me of a particularly interesting side note that I think we need to talk about right now. And it's the idea that while it is true that a group can only find progress if groups outside of that group come along for the ride, we also need to remember that we shouldn't assume to know what's most important to every single member of every single community. In other words, just because you see somebody who is of a particular community doesn't mean that that is their most important feature or the feature that they base all their life decisions around. For example, if someone is part of a particular racial group, we shouldn't assume that they will only vote for candidates of that group, or that issues concerning that racial group are their most important issues. Their political leanings and the issues that they care most about might have nothing to do with their race. And going back to Harry's point, one of the biggest things he had to talk about was how Eugene was being used and how it differed from the champion at the time, Chris Benoit, which is a problem that has absolutely nothing at all to do with the characterization of Eugene. But of course, Harry's opinion is just the opinion of one person, although I do totally agree about the Chris Benoit thing. Anyway, what about the opinions of some other wrestling fans with autism? Well, for that, we have to go to an interview with one Brian Zane. Not only has Brian done his own fantastic video on the subject of Eugene over on his channel Wrestling with Regret, but he also gave an interview for CulturedVultures.com in an article called Wrestling and Autism in Conversation with Brian Zane. Now, the writer of the article, Thomas Broom Jones, is on the spectrum himself, and he talks about what wrestling is like specifically for people with autism. And he would also go on to say that he has mixed feelings on the character of Eugene, but he mentioned that after his conversation with Brian Zane, he reconsidered his stance on the character. As Brian would state, looking back, and I can't believe I'm admitting this, I think Eugene might actually be one of the best portrayals of an autistic person you could possibly do in wrestling. Even though his on-air persona was more of a catch-all for a variety of learning disabilities and was never narrowed down to one specific condition, his speaking patterns and his movements, especially at the beginning, were actually really well done, if perhaps a little extreme. But ultimately, I think the character has to be cranked up to 11 in order to register with fans. It's akin to throwing a punch in the ring. You have to wind back and follow all the way through with big motions because the people in the cheap seats need to be able to see it. Now, there's a lot more to this article, so please read it for yourself. And, as I already mentioned, Brian Zane has a fantastic video all about Eugene. I highly encourage you to check it out if you haven't already, and of course subscribe to his channel too. Oh, and also, Harry Flynn has his own YouTube channel that is also worth checking out as well. Okay, so now, looking at all this, I am still just asking a question. Is the character of Eugene offensive? Now, of course, everyone has the right to be offended by whatever it is they're offended by. Although, I do have to say, I do think there's a value in finding out whether the offensive nature is something that happens inwardly or is it something that happens from outside. And if it is an instance where you're offended on someone else's behalf, I really do also think that there's a value in finding out what that someone else thinks in the first place. I want to give a big thank you to Harry Flynn for being on this episode, as well as give a shout out to Brian Zane and Wrestling with Regret. I also want to thank all of you for watching, as well as all of my awesome Patreon supporters out there. Thank all of you so much, and as always, Dave knows.